Sometimes a man's final choice reveals more about his heart than a lifetime of words ever could. When facing death, we discover who we truly are beneath all the pretense and pride. In the small town of Perdition Ridge, gunslinger Rafe Dalton is sentenced to hang by sunrise. The cruel Judge Morrison offers him a twisted deal: choose any bride in town and live, or hang tonight. The whole town watches as women turn away, ashamed and afraid. But Rafe points to Emma Thornton, a young woman in a wheelchair who everyone has forgotten. She was paralyzed years ago and now lives as an outcast. When he chooses her, the judge stops laughing and the town falls silent. Emma stares back at Rafe with fire in her eyes. But what drove a man facing death to choose the one woman nobody wanted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Perdition Ridge, a town that had seen better days and forgotten what hope looked like. Dust swirled through empty streets where weeds pushed through cracked boardwalks, and the few remaining businesses bore the weathered look of places holding on by sheer stubbornness. In the dim light of the jailhouse, Rafe Dalton sat with his back against the cold stone wall, hands bound but his mind surprisingly calm. At 34, he'd lived more lives than most men twice his age. The notorious gunslinger's reputation had preceded him across 3 territories. Rafe Dalton, the fastest draw south of Denver, the man who'd robbed banks from Kansas to California and never killed a man who didn't draw first. But now, staring at the tarnished sheriff's badge hanging on the wall, a badge that had belonged to Sheriff Thomas Thornton before his death 3 years ago, Rafe felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment. The badge caught the morning light, its surface scratched and worn, much like the town itself. Judge Morrison entered the cell area, his black robes rustling with self-importance. At 62, Harrison Morrison ruled Perdition Ridge with an iron fist wrapped in legal proceedings. His weathered face bore the permanent sneer of a man who'd found power in a forgotten corner of the world and intended to keep it. "Well, Mr. Dalton," Morrison's voice carried the theatrical tone of a man who enjoyed his own performances. "Ready to meet your maker?" Rafe didn't look up. "Been ready for years, Judge. Just took this long to get caught." Morrison chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Such resignation from a man with your reputation. They say you once faced down 6 men in Dodge City. They say a lot of things." The judge studied Rafe with calculating eyes. Morrison had built his reputation on cruel entertainment, turning justice into spectacle for his own amusement. The hanging of Rafe Dalton would be the biggest event Perdition Ridge had seen in years. "You know," Morrison said, settling into the wooden chair across from the cell, "I've been thinking about your situation. It seems almost wasteful to hang such a capable man." Rafe finally looked up, recognizing the tone. He'd heard it before from men who thought they were clever. "Get to the point, Judge." Morrison's smile widened. "Very well, I'm prepared to offer you an alternative to the noose. Choose any unmarried woman in this town to be your bride, and I'll commute your sentence to life in prison. Refuse, and you hang at sunrise." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Rafe had expected many things, but not this twisted game. "Any woman?" Rafe asked. "Any unmarried woman who'll have you, though I suspect your options will be rather limited." Morrison's laugh echoed off the stone walls. 3 blocks away, in a small house that had seen better days, Emma Thornton sat by her window watching the morning activity. At 26, she possessed a quiet strength that tragedy had forged rather than broken. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight as she worked on mending a dress, one of the few ways she could earn a small income in a town that had largely forgotten she existed. The wheelchair had been her companion for 3 years now, ever since the raid that had changed everything. Before that terrible night, she'd been Sheriff Thomas Thornton's daughter, beloved by the community, courted by several young men, and full of dreams for the future. The raid had taken her father's life and her ability to walk, leaving her with memories of a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else. Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor and one of her few remaining friends, knocked softly on the doorframe. "Emma, dear, are you up for a visitor?" Emma turned from the window, managing a small smile. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson, come in." The older woman entered, her grey hair neatly pinned and her kind eyes full of concern. At 73, Millicent Patterson had been a pillar of the community. For decades, one of the few people who still treated Emma with the dignity she'd once taken for granted. "I've just come from town," Mrs. Patterson said, settling into the worn armchair near Emma's window. "There's quite a commotion about that gunslinger they caught." Emma nodded. "I heard about the capture. Father would have been pleased to see. Justice served." "Yes, well, that's what I wanted to discuss with you." Mrs. Patterson's voice carried an unusual tension. "Judge Morrison has made rather an unusual proposal to the man." Emma listened as Mrs. Patterson explained the judge's twisted bargain, her heart sinking with each word. She'd known Harrison Morrison since childhood, had watched him grow more cruel and theatrical with each passing year. This sounded exactly like the kind of spectacle he'd devise. "The whole town will be there to watch," Mrs. Patterson concluded. "Morrison's turning it into some sort of entertainment." Emma's hands stilled on her mending. "And the women? What do they think of being used as pawns in the judge's game?" "Most are terrified, dear. They're hoping the gunslinger will simply choose the noose rather than force any of them into such a situation." Emma stared out the window at the dusty street, thinking about the fear those women must be feeling. She remembered what it was like to be desired, to have choices, to matter to someone. Now she existed on the margins, dependent on charity and the kindness of neighbors, like Mrs. Patterson. "When will this spectacle take place?" Emma asked quietly. "This afternoon. Morrison wants the whole town gathered in the square." Emma nodded, turning her attention back to her sewing, but her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and Mrs. Patterson noticed. "Emma, you don't need to attend if it would upset you." "No," Emma said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'll be there. Someone should witness what passes for justice in this town." As Mrs. Patterson prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Emma, dear, you know that your worth isn't determined by what others think of you, don't you?" Emma managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know, Mrs. Patterson, but sometimes it's hard to remember." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the townspeople gathered in the square, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and nervous excitement. Judge Morrison stood on the courthouse steps like an actor preparing for his greatest performance, while Rafe Dalton was brought out in shackles, his expression unreadable. Emma positioned her wheelchair at the edge of the crowd, Mrs. Patterson standing beside her. She watched as Morrison began his theatrical speech about mercy and second chances, knowing it was all performance designed to amuse the judge rather than serve any real justice. The women of the town clustered together, whispering and casting nervous glances at the condemned man. Emma recognized most of them, women who had once been her friends, who now looked past her as if she were invisible. As Morrison's voice rose to announce the gunslinger's choice, Emma found herself studying Rafe Dalton's face. There was something in his expression, a calmness that spoke of a man who had already made peace with his fate. She wondered what thoughts occupied his mind in these final moments before Morrison's cruel game began. Judge Morrison's voice boomed across the town square, relishing every word of his theatrical proclamation. "Ladies and gentlemen of Perdition Ridge, we gather today not just for justice, but for mercy. Mr. Rafe Dalton stands before us, condemned to hang for his crimes. But in the spirit of Christian compassion, I offer him a choice that may yet save his life." The crowd murmured among themselves, a mix of anticipation and unease rippling through the gathered townspeople. Emma watched from her position at the edge, noting how the unmarried women seemed to shrink back into the crowd, hoping to become invisible. "The choice is simple," Morrison continued, his eyes gleaming with malicious pleasure. "Choose any unmarried woman in this town to be your bride, and I'll spare your life. You'll serve your time in prison rather than meet the hangman's noose. But choose wisely, Mr. Dalton, for this offer expires with the setting sun." Rafe stood motionless, his weathered hands still shackled, surveying the crowd with calm deliberation. The afternoon heat pressed down on everyone, but he seemed untouched by it, as if he'd already stepped beyond the reach of earthly discomforts. "Well?" Morrison prompted, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "What's it to be, life or death?" Emma found herself holding her breath, along with everyone else. She watched as Rafe's gaze moved methodically across the gathered women, most of whom had turned their faces away or stepped behind their male companions. Then, unexpectedly, his eyes found hers. For a moment that seemed to stretch like taffy in the summer heat, they simply looked at each other across the dusty square. Emma saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. Not pity, not desperation, but a kind of recognition, as if he were seeing her truly for the first time. Rafe raised his shackled hands and pointed directly at her. "Her," he said. His voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. "Emma Thornton!" The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Judge Morrison's confident smile faltered, his face paling as he followed. Rafe's pointed finger to where Emma sat in her wheelchair. "I beg your pardon," Morrison sputtered, his theatrical composure cracking. "You heard me, Judge. Emma Thornton, Sheriff Thornton's daughter." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. Every eye in the square turned to stare at her, and she could feel the weight of their shock, their pity, their morbid curiosity. Mrs. Patterson's hand fell protectively on her shoulder. "Now see here," Morrison began, struggling to regain his authority. "Perhaps you didn't understand the parameters." "I understood perfectly." Rafe's voice cut through the judge's protests with quiet authority. "You said any unmarried woman in town. Emma Thornton is unmarried, and she's a woman. Unless you're planning to go back on your word in front of all these witnesses." Morrison's face flushed red, then white again. He clearly hadn't expected this twist in his carefully orchestrated drama. The crowd watched in fascination as the judge found himself caught in his own trap. Emma finally found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "I haven't agreed to anything." Her words carried across the square, and she saw Rafe's expression soften slightly. He nodded respectfully in her direction. "No, ma'am, you haven't, and you shouldn't have to agree to something like this. But if you're willing to consider it, I'd be grateful for the chance to explain why I made this choice." Morrison stepped forward, his authority reasserted by anger. "This is preposterous. The woman is—" He caught himself before saying something that would damn him further in front of the crowd. "The woman is what, Judge?" Rafe's voice carried a dangerous edge now. "Go ahead and finish that sentence." Emma could see the trap closing. Around Morrison could see his realization that any words he chose would either insult her publicly or acknowledge that his offer had been genuine. The judge's cruel game was backfiring spectacularly. "This is highly irregular," Morrison said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Irregular, maybe, but not illegal, according to your own terms." Rafe turned his attention back. "To Emma, Miss Thornton, would you be willing to speak with me privately? I understand this comes as a shock, and I don't expect an immediate answer." Emma's mind raced. Part of her wanted to flee, to wheel herself away from this public humiliation as quickly as possible. But another part, a part that had been buried, under 3 years of pity and isolation, stirred to life. When was the last time anyone had asked for her opinion on anything that mattered? When was the last time someone had treated her like a person capable of making her own choices? "Yes," she heard herself saying. "Yes, I'll speak with you." The crowd erupted in whispers and exclamations. Judge Morrison looked like a man who'd bitten into an apple only to find a worm, his carefully orchestrated entertainment spinning beyond his control. "Very well," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "You have until sunset to decide. Guards, escort them to the courthouse for their conversation." As the deputies moved to comply, Emma felt Mrs. Patterson lean down to whisper in her ear. "Are you certain about this, dear? You don't have to subject yourself to—" "I know what I'm doing," Emma said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. But for the first time in 3 years, someone was treating her like she mattered, like her choice carried weight. Even if it was just a desperate man facing death, it was more consideration than she'd received from anyone else in longer than she cared to remember. The courthouse was blessedly cool after the heat of the square. Emma's wheelchair rolled smoothly across the polished floor as a deputy led them to a small conference room, typically used for legal consultations. Rafe's shackles clinked softly as he took a seat across the wooden table from her. For a moment, they simply studied each other in the relative privacy. Emma found herself looking at a man who seemed far different from the notorious gunslinger of reputation. His eyes held intelligence and something that might have been regret. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why me?" Rafe was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Because in all that crowd of people staring at me like I was some kind of carnival attraction, you were the only one who looked at me like I was human. And because your father was a good man who deserved better than what this town gave him." Emma's breath caught. "You knew my father?" "Not well, but our paths crossed a few times over the years. He could have arrested me twice, had cause to both times. Instead, he talked to me, treated me like a man who might still have some good left in him, instead of just another outlaw to be hunted down." The simple gold wedding ring that had belonged to her mother felt heavy in Emma's dress pocket, where she'd carried it every day since the funeral. She'd never expected to have reason to wear it. "This isn't charity," Rafe continued quietly, "and it's not pity. If you agree to this, it'll be because you choose to. And if you don't, I'll face the noose with no hard feelings." Emma studied his face, searching for deception or manipulation. Instead, she found something she'd almost forgotten existed: simple, honest respect. Outside, the sun continued its relentless march toward the horizon, and Emma realized that she had the most important decision of her life to make. The evening shadows stretched long across Emma's small house as she sat by the window, the faded photograph of her and her father clutched in her trembling hands. In the picture, she was 17, standing tall and confident beside Sheriff Thomas Thornton in his crisp uniform. They were both smiling, arms around each other, the future stretching ahead of them like an endless summer day. That girl in the photograph felt like a stranger now. Sleep had been impossible. Emma's mind churned with the impossible choice before her, replaying every word of her conversation with Rafe Dalton, every nuance of his expression. The courthouse clock had chimed midnight, then 1, then 2, and still she sat awake, wrestling with a decision that would determine not just his fate, but her own. Mrs. Patterson had stayed late into the evening, bringing tea and quiet comfort, but even her gentle presence couldn't calm the storm in Emma's thoughts. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness, Emma faced the harsh mathematics of her situation. At 26, she had no prospects. The few young men who had once courted her had long since married others or left town entirely. Her injury had rendered her, in the eyes of most people, damaged goods, someone to be pitied but never truly desired. She survived on charity and the meager income from her sewing, dependent on others for everything from groceries to basic companionship. The town had grieved with her initially, had rallied around the sheriff's daughter in the aftermath of tragedy. But grief had a shelf life, and after 3 years, people had moved on with their lives while she remained frozen in place, a reminder of violence they preferred to forget. Dr. Hayes had been blunt about her medical prospects during those early, dark months. The damage is permanent, Emma. I'm sorry, but you need to understand that. The bullet fragments are too close to the spinal cord to risk removal, and the swelling has caused irreversible damage. You'll need to adapt to a new way of living. Adaptation. Such a clinical word for the complete reconstruction of everything she'd believed about her future. Before the raid, she'd been Thomas Thornton's confident daughter, the young woman who helped her father with paperwork, who knew everyone in town and was known by them in return. She'd had dreams of marriage, children, a life full of purpose and connection. The chair had stolen all of that, or so she'd believed. But sitting across from Rafe Dalton in that courthouse conference room, she'd felt something stir that she'd thought was dead forever. The sense that someone saw her as more than just her limitations. "Your father saved my life once," Rafe had told her quietly. "It was about 2 years before the raid. I'd been shot in a scrape with some claim jumpers up near Silver Creek, crawled into town half dead, and most folks would have let me bleed out rather than help an outlaw. But your father, he saw me as a man in need of help first, and a criminal second." Emma had listened, captivated despite herself by this glimpse into her father's character that she'd never known. "He could have arrested me the moment I was healed enough to travel. Had wanted posters and everything. Instead, he sat by my bed in Doc Hayes' office and talked to me about choices, about how a man's past doesn't have to determine his future, if he's willing to make different decisions." "What did you tell him?" Emma had asked. "That I wasn't ready to change, that the outlaw life was all I knew, and I was too proud and too angry to consider anything else." Rafe's eyes had grown distant with memory. He said he understood, but that the offer would stand if I ever decided I wanted something different. Said good men could come from the unlikeliest places. Now, as dawn light began to creep through her windows, Emma wondered if her father would have approved of her, considering this impossible marriage. Would he have seen it as a chance for redemption, both hers and Rafe's? Or would he have been horrified at the thought of his daughter bound to a notorious gunslinger? She wheeled herself to her small writing desk and pulled out the letter she'd started and abandoned 3 times during the night. Her handwriting looked shaky in the lamplight, reflecting the tremor in her hands. Mrs. Patterson arrived just after sunrise, as Emma had known she would. The older woman's face was etched with concern and sleeplessness. "My dear girl," Mrs. Patterson said, settling into her usual chair with a soft sigh. "You look like you haven't slept a wink." "I haven't." Emma set down her pen and turned to face her friend. "Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something honestly?" "Always, dear." "What kind of life do I have here?" "Really?" Emma's voice was steady, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm 26 years old, and I spend my days sewing other women's wedding dresses and watching life happen through my window. I have no prospects, no future beyond growing old alone in this house, dependent on the charity of others." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened with understanding. "Oh, Emma, I'm not feeling sorry for myself," Emma continued quickly. "I'm just trying to be realistic about my choices. Mr. Dalton didn't offer me charity or pity. He offered me a chance to matter again, to be someone's partner instead of someone's burden. But the man is an outlaw, dear. His reputation is just that, reputation. I looked into his eyes yesterday, and I didn't see a cold-blooded killer. I saw a man who's made mistakes and knows it. A man who respected my father and spoke of him with genuine admiration." Emma paused, choosing her words carefully. "When was the last time anyone in this town looked at me and saw anything other than poor, crippled Emma Thornton?" Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Finally she spoke. "Your parents would want you to be happy, Emma. They'd want you to have a life full of purpose and dignity. Then you think I should accept?" "I think," Mrs. Patterson said slowly, "that you're the only one who can make this decision. But I also think that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances can lead to the greatest blessings. Your father always said that people deserve second chances, didn't he? Emma nodded, remembering her father's patient approach to justice, his belief that redemption was possible for anyone willing to seek it. There's something else, Emma said quietly. When Mr. Dalton chose me yesterday, for just a moment I felt like the person I used to be, like someone worth choosing. Mrs. Patterson reached across the space between them and took Emma's hands. In her own. You are worth choosing, dear girl. You've always been worth choosing. Perhaps it just took an unlikely source to remind you of that truth. As the morning sun climbed higher, Emma made her decision. She would accept Rafe Dalton's proposal, not out of desperation or lack of alternatives, but because for the first time in 3 years, someone was offering her the chance to be a partner rather than a patient, a wife rather than a ward. The town square was filling with people again. As Emma made her way toward the courthouse, Mrs. Patterson walking beside her wheelchair. Word had spread quickly about the unprecedented situation, and it seemed like half of Perdition Ridge had turned out to witness the resolution of Judge Morrison's twisted game. Emma held her mother's wedding ring in her palm, feeling its familiar weight. She'd made her choice, and whatever came next, it would be her choice to make. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Emma wheeled herself forward, Mrs. Patterson's steady presence beside her offering silent support. The gathered crowd fell quiet as she approached, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, pity, and barely concealed excitement at witnessing such an unusual spectacle. Judge Morrison stood on the courthouse steps, his black robes billowing in the morning breeze, his expression sour with disappointment that his cruel entertainment had taken such an unexpected turn. Rafe Dalton waited in shackles beside 2 deputies, his calm demeanor unchanged from the previous day. "Well, Miss Thornton," Morrison called out, his voice carrying across the square with theatrical projection. "Have you reached a decision regarding Mr. Dalton's rather unusual proposal?" Emma took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every eye upon her. She'd rehearsed this moment through the long, sleepless night, but now that it was here, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. "I have, Your Honor." Her voice carried clearly across the square, steadier than she'd expected. "I accept Mr. Dalton's proposal of marriage." The reaction was immediate and varied. Some women in the crowd gasped in shock, while others shook their heads in what might have been sympathy or disapproval. The men seemed divided between those who thought she was making a terrible mistake and those who grudgingly admired her courage. Morrison's face flushed with barely controlled anger. "Are you quite certain, Miss Thornton? This is not a decision to be made lightly, considering the circumstances." "I'm certain." Emma's voice grew stronger with each word, "and I'd appreciate it if we could proceed with the arrangements promptly." Rafe stepped forward as much as his shackles would allow, offering her a small nod of acknowledgement and what might have been gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Thornton. I won't forget this kindness." "It's not kindness, Mr. Dalton. It's a choice I'm making, for my own reasons." The distinction was important to Emma, and she could see in Rafe's slight smile that he understood the difference. Morrison cleared his throat, clearly struggling to maintain his authority over the situation that had so spectacularly escaped his control. "Very well. The ceremony will take place this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Reverend Phillips will officiate." As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with conversation about the morning's developments, Mrs. Patterson approached Emma with tears in her eyes. "Are you certain about this, dear?" the older woman asked quietly. "Once it's done, there's no going back." Emma reached up and squeezed Mrs. Patterson's hand. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. For the first time in 3 years, someone is treating me like I have something valuable to offer." The afternoon hours passed in a blur of preparation. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on helping Emma ready herself for the ceremony, and they'd spent considerable time altering her mother's wedding dress to accommodate the wheelchair. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but it was still beautiful, and wearing it made Emma feel connected to happier times. "Your mother would be so proud," Mrs. Patterson said, as she fastened the small pearl buttons along the back of the dress. "She always said you had more courage than anyone gave you credit for." Emma touched the faded photograph on her dresser, the one showing her young and whole beside her father. "I hope I'm doing the right thing. Courage isn't about being certain, dear. It's about moving forward even when you're afraid." Dr. Hayes had stopped by earlier, ostensibly to check on Emma's health, but clearly motivated by concern about her decision. His weathered face had been etched with worry as he'd examined her. "Emma, I feel I must ask, are you entering into this marriage of your own free will? Because if there's any coercion involved, there's no coercion, Dr. Hayes. Mr. Dalton has been nothing but respectful, and he's made it clear that I can change my mind at any time. But marriage to a man with his reputation is based on his past, not necessarily his character. My father always said people could change if they truly wanted to." Dr. Hayes had sighed, recognizing the stubborn determination that had helped Emma survive her darkest days. "Very well. But promise me you'll be careful, and if you ever need anything at all, you know where to find me." Now, as 3 o'clock approached, Emma sat before her small mirror, trying to see herself as a bride rather than an object of pity. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow. Not the confident girl from the photograph, but not the broken victim either. Someone new, perhaps. Someone ready to take control of her own story. Reverend Phillips arrived at the courthouse, looking deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. A thin, nervous man in his 50s, he'd served the spiritual needs of Perdition Ridge for over a decade, and had never been asked to perform quite such an unusual ceremony. "Miss Thornton," he said quietly, as Mrs. Patterson wheeled her toward the courthouse steps, "are you absolutely certain about this? Marriage is a sacred covenant, not to be entered into lightly, especially under such extraordinary circumstances." "I understand the gravity of what I'm doing, Reverend Phillips. I'm entering this marriage with full knowledge and consent." The ceremony itself was brief and surprisingly dignified. Judge Morrison had insisted it take place on the courthouse steps, where the entire town could witness it, but Reverend Phillips conducted himself with appropriate solemnity despite the unusual circumstances. Rafe had been allowed to remove his shackles for the ceremony, though 2 deputies stood ready nearby. He looked surprisingly formal in his cleaned prison clothes, his dark hair combed back, his expression serious as he took his place beside Emma's wheelchair. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Phillips began, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Rafe Dalton and Emma Thornton in holy matrimony." Emma found herself studying Rafe's profile as the Reverend spoke. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of hard living and difficult choices, but also something she was beginning to recognize as fundamental decency. This close, she could see that his hands, now unshackled, were calloused from work, but gentle in their movements. When it came time for the vows, Rafe turned to face her directly, his voice clear and steady. "I, Rafe Dalton, take you, Emma Thornton, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, to honor and protect, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, for as long as we both shall live." The traditional words took on unexpected weight in their unusual circumstances. Emma felt her voice catch slightly as she responded with her own vows, but she managed to speak clearly enough for everyone to hear. When Reverend Phillips pronounced them husband and wife, Rafe surprised everyone by leaning down to kiss Emma's hand rather than her lips, a gesture of respect that didn't go unnoticed by the watching crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Phillips announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Rafe Dalton." The applause was scattered and uncertain, but Mrs. Patterson clapped enthusiastically, and Emma caught sight of Dr. Hayes nodding approvingly at Rafe's courteous behavior. As the crowd began to disperse, Judge Morrison approached the newlywed couple, his expression still sour with disappointment. "Well, Mr. Dalton, you've bought yourself some time. Your sentence is commuted to life imprisonment, to begin immediately." Understood, Your Honor. Thank you for honoring your word. Emma felt a sudden chill at the reminder that while she'd gained a husband, he would immediately be taken from her to serve his sentence. The reality of their situation settled over her like a cold wind. But as Rafe was led away by the deputies, he turned back to give her one last look, not of regret or fear, but of something that might have been hope. 3 months into their unusual marriage, Emma wheeled herself along the dusty path to the Perdition Ridge jail, carrying a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. The wooden bird that Rafe had carved for her during their brief courtship sat on her kitchen windowsill, catching the morning light, a symbol of the unexpected tenderness that had begun to grow between them. Their relationship had developed in the cramped confines of visiting hours, through conversations conducted, through iron bars, and in the small courtesies that had surprised both of them. What had started as mutual respect, born of desperate circumstances, was slowly transforming into something deeper and more genuine. Sheriff Davies, who had replaced her father after the raid, nodded as she approached the jailhouse entrance. At 55, Davies was a competent lawman, but lacked her father's natural authority and respected judgment. "Morning, Mrs. Dalton," he said, touching his hat brim respectfully. "Rafe's been asking about you since dawn." Emma smiled at the use of her married name. It had taken some adjustment for the townspeople, but most had begun to accept the reality of her situation, and some had even begun to show grudging respect for her choice. The jail's interior was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the mounting heat outside. Rafe stood as she approached his cell, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure at seeing her. The transformation in his appearance over the past 3 months had been remarkable. Regular meals and the absence of life on the run had filled out his lean frame, and there was a calmness in his demeanor that spoke of a man finding peace with his circumstances. "Emma," he said softly, stepping to the bars, "you're a sight for sore eyes. I brought you some fresh bread and that apple preserves you mentioned liking." Emma positioned her wheelchair where they could speak comfortably, though the iron bars remained a constant reminder of the boundaries of their relationship. "You spoil me," Rafe said, accepting the basket with gratitude. "Mrs. Patterson's recipe? Mine, actually. She taught me before Father died. I'd forgotten I knew how to make it until you mentioned remembering the smell from your childhood." Their conversations had become a daily ritual, a bright spot in both their confined lives. Emma had discovered that beneath Rafe's reputation as a dangerous outlaw lay a man of surprising intelligence and unexpected gentleness. He spoke thoughtfully about books she lent him, asked genuine questions about her daily life, and had somehow managed to make her feel valued in ways she'd forgotten were possible. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Rafe said, settling onto his narrow cot while Emma arranged her skirts more comfortably. "About feeling useless since the accident." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd shared more with Rafe during these visits than she had with anyone since her father's death, finding in him a willing listener who never offered empty platitudes or false reassurances. "I shouldn't have burdened you with my complaints." "They're not complaints, Emma. They're honest feelings from someone who's had to rebuild her entire life. That takes courage most people never have to find." The way he said her name had changed over the months, becoming softer, more intimate. Emma found herself looking forward to hearing it, to seeing the gentle expression that crossed his face when he spoke to her. "I've been reading that book you brought me," Rafe continued, "the one about teaching children to read. It got me thinking, maybe there's a way for you to feel useful again, even with the limitations you're facing." Emma raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean? Half the kids in this town can't read properly. Their parents are too busy trying to survive to teach them, and the school teacher left last year. You've got the education and the patience for it. Maybe you could start teaching some of them." The suggestion caught Emma off guard. She hadn't considered that her confinement to a wheelchair might not prevent her from contributing meaningfully to the community. The idea stirred something in her that had been dormant for too long. I don't know if anyone would trust me with their children. Mrs. Patterson would. Dr. Hayes would. And once people see the results, others will follow. You underestimate how much respect your father's name still carries in this town. Emma found herself studying Rafe's face, noting the earnestness in his expression. You really think I could do something like that? I think you could do anything you set your mind to, Emma. Being in this wheelchair doesn't change who you are inside. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy boots on the wooden walkway outside. Emma turned to see Judge Morrison approaching, his black coat billowing dramatically as always, his expression darker than usual. "Mrs. Dalton," Morrison said with barely concealed disdain. "How touching to see such marital devotion." Emma straightened, in her wheelchair, meeting the judge's gaze steadily. "Good morning, Your Honor. Is there something you need?" Morrison's smile was cold and predatory. "Actually, there is. I've received some interesting correspondence from the Territorial Marshal's office. It seems there are some questions about your husband's past that require investigation." Rafe stood slowly, moving to the front of his cell. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about your involvement in certain raids, certain deaths that may not have been as justified as previously believed." Morrison's voice carried the satisfaction of a cat playing with a trapped mouse. "Questions that might require a re-evaluation of your sentence." Emma felt ice form in her stomach. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the possibility that your husband here might face charges for murder in addition to his current sentence, capital charges." Morrison's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. "It would be such a shame if your brief marriage were to end so abruptly." Emma's hands gripped the arms of her wheelchair until her knuckles went white. She could see the careful control Rafe was maintaining, the way his jaw tightened as he processed Morrison's words. "And I suppose you're eager to facilitate this investigation?" Rafe asked quietly. "It's my duty as a servant of justice," Morrison replied with mock solemnity. "Though I must admit, there's a certain poetic justice to it all. Your little romantic fairy tale coming to such an unfortunate end." Emma found her voice, though it trembled with suppressed anger. "You're enjoying this." "I'm serving justice, Mrs. Dalton, though I realize that distinction might be lost on someone who chose to marry a known criminal." The insult hit its mark, but Emma refused to give Morrison the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Instead, she wheeled her chair closer to Rafe's cell, positioning herself between him and the judge. "My husband has been a model prisoner for 3 months. He's shown nothing but respect for the law and for everyone in this community. If you're so concerned with justice, perhaps you should focus on serving it fairly rather than using it as entertainment." Morrison's face darkened at her defiance. "Careful, Mrs. Dalton. Loyalty to your husband is admirable, but blind loyalty can be dangerous." After Morrison left, Emma and Rafe sat in heavy silence for several minutes. The warmth and hope that had characterized their relationship seemed suddenly fragile, threatened by forces beyond their control. "I'm sorry, Emma," Rafe said finally. "I never meant for you to be dragged into something like this." "You didn't drag me into anything. I chose this, remember?" Emma reached through the bars to touch his hand, a gesture that had become natural over the months. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Rafe's fingers intertwined with hers, and she could feel the calluses on his palms, evidence of the honest work he'd been doing in his cell. Carving, writing, reading. The wooden bird he'd made for her had taken weeks of patient effort, each tiny feather carefully shaped with makeshift tools. "Emma, if Morrison manages to bring new charges against me, then we'll fight them. We'll find witnesses, evidence, whatever it takes to prove your innocence. And if we can't," Emma met his eyes steadily, "then we'll face whatever comes with dignity." but I won't let Morrison destroy what we've built together without a fight." As she prepared to leave that afternoon, Emma found herself changed by Morrison's threat. The comfortable routine of their developing relationship had been shattered, replaced by a sense of urgency and determination she hadn't felt since before her father's death. The townspeople she passed on her way home looked at her differently. Now, she realized, some with pity, others with curiosity, but increasingly with a kind of respect. Her marriage to Rafe Dalton had transformed her from an object of charity into someone who had made a choice and was living with the consequences. That evening, as she sat by her window looking at the wooden bird Rafe had carved, Emma made a decision. She wouldn't passively wait for Morrison to destroy her marriage and her husband's life. If there was evidence to be found, witnesses to be located, or arguments to be made, she would find them. For the first time since the raid that had changed everything, Emma Thornton Dalton felt like she had a purpose worth fighting for. 6 months into their marriage, Emma had transformed from the forgotten sheriff's daughter into something unexpected, a force to be reckoned with. The loaded pistol hidden in the specially modified compartment of her wheelchair represented more than protection. It symbolized her refusal to remain helpless in the face of Judge Morrison's escalating campaign of intimidation. Emma wheeled herself through the dusty streets of Perdition Ridge with newfound purpose. Her daily visits to the jail now accompanied by careful observation of the town's power structure. She'd begun to see patterns in Morrison's behavior, connections between his decisions and certain influential townspeople that painted a disturbing picture of corruption. The physical therapy sessions with Rafe's encouragement had yielded unexpected results. While she would never walk again, Emma had regained significant strength in her arms and core, and her balance had improved dramatically. More importantly, she'd rediscovered her sense of agency, the belief that she could influence her circumstances rather than merely endure them. "You look different today," Rafe observed as she approached his cell that morning. "Determined. What's on your mind?" Emma positioned her wheelchair in their usual spot, but there was a new tension in her posture, a sharpness to her attention that spoke of plans forming. "I've been listening, Rafe. Really listening to what people say when they think I'm not paying attention. And what are you hearing? Things about Judge Morrison that don't add up. Business dealings that seem questionable, decisions that favor certain people over others, patterns that suggest he might not be the upstanding pillar of justice he pretends to be." Rafe leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "Emma, whatever. You're thinking you need to be careful. Morrison is a dangerous man, and if he suspects you're investigating him, he already suspects it. Yesterday, his clerk asked Mrs. Patterson some very pointed questions about my activities, what I do during the day, who I talk to. He's watching me, Rafe." The knowledge should have been frightening, but instead, Emma felt a clarity of purpose she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. For too long, she'd been reactive, allowing events to shape her life rather than taking control of her destiny. "I need to tell you something," Emma continued, her voice dropping to ensure. Their conversation remained private. "Mrs. Patterson's health is failing faster than she's letting on. Dr. Hayes told me in confidence that she probably has 6 months at most." The news hit Rafe like a physical blow. Mrs. Patterson had become a surrogate mother to Emma, one of the few people in town who'd consistently shown her kindness and respect. Her loss would leave Emma more isolated than ever. "I'm sorry, Emma. I know how much she means to you. She's been the closest thing to family I've had since Father died. But, Rafe, before she goes, she wants to tell me something about the night of the raid. Something she's kept secret for 3 years because she was afraid of what Morrison might do to her if she spoke up." Emma's revelation sent a chill down Rafe's spine. The raid that had killed Sheriff Thornton and paralyzed Emma had always seemed suspicious to him. Too well coordinated, too precisely timed to be a random attack by desperate outlaws. "What kind of secret?" Emma glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer to the bars. She saw something that night, Rafe. Someone who shouldn't have been where they were, doing something that didn't make sense at the time, but makes perfect sense now. Before she could elaborate, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Sheriff Davies appeared, his expression troubled and apologetic. "Mrs. Dalton, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Judge Morrison wants to see you in his chambers immediately." Emma felt her blood turn to ice. Morrison's summons could only mean one thing. He was escalating his campaign of intimidation, moving from subtle threats to direct confrontation. "Did he say what this is about?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "No, Mom, just said it was urgent and concerned your husband's case." Emma reached through the bars to squeeze Rafe's hand, drawing strength from the contact. "I'll be back," she promised him. "Emma, be careful. Don't let him provoke you into saying something that could make things worse." Judge Morrison's chambers occupied the most imposing space in the courthouse, filled with law books and dark furniture that seemed designed to intimidate visitors. Morrison sat behind his massive oak desk like a spider in the center of its web, his cold eyes fixed on Emma as she was wheeled into the room. "Mrs. Dalton, thank you for coming so promptly." Morrison's voice carried false courtesy that fooled no one. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Emma positioned her wheelchair directly across from his desk, meeting his gaze with steady defiance. "You wanted to see me about my husband's case, among other things." Morrison steepled his fingers, studying her with calculating eyes. "I understand you've been quite active in the community lately, visiting with various townspeople, asking questions about local history. I'm trying to understand the community I married into. Surely that's natural for any new bride." Natural, perhaps, but also potentially dangerous, depending on what kinds of questions one asks. Morrison's smile was cold as winter steel. For instance, questions about certain business relationships, certain decisions that might be misunderstood by someone unfamiliar with the complexities of local politics. Emma felt her heart racing but kept her expression neutral. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Your Honor." "I'm implying, Mrs. Dalton, that curiosity can be a dangerous trait, especially for someone in your vulnerable position." Morrison rose from his chair and moved to stand beside her wheelchair, a deliberate invasion of her personal space designed to emphasize her physical limitations. "You depend on the goodwill of this community for everything, your livelihood, your safety, your husband's continued well-being. It would be unfortunate if that goodwill were to be jeopardized by unnecessary meddling in matters that don't concern you." The threat was clear, but instead of cowering, Emma felt anger flare within her, clean, righteous anger that burned away her fear and uncertainty. "Are you threatening me, Judge Morrison? I'm advising you as a concerned member of this community who has your best interests at heart. Your husband is facing serious charges that could result in his execution. Surely your efforts would be better spent preparing for that possibility rather than pursuing distractions." Emma's hands tightened on the arms of her wheelchair, but her voice remained steady. "My husband is innocent of any capital crimes, and I intend to prove it." Morrison's facade of civilized concern cracked, revealing the malice beneath. "Your husband is a known outlaw and killer, Mrs. Dalton. The only reason he's still breathing is my mercy in allowing your pathetic marriage to proceed. Don't mistake that mercy for weakness, and don't mistake my circumstances for helplessness, Your Honor. I may be confined to this wheelchair, but I'm still Sheriff Thomas Thornton's daughter, and I haven't forgotten what justice looks like." The mention of her father's name struck home, and Emma saw Morrison's composure slip further. There was something there, guilt, fear, or recognition, that confirmed her growing suspicions about the judge's role in the events that had destroyed her family. "Your father was an idealistic fool who didn't understand the realities of governing. A frontier town," Morrison spat. His naive approach to law enforcement made him a liability. "My father was an honest man who served this community with integrity, something you wouldn't recognize." Morrison's face flushed with anger, his mask of judicial dignity finally slipping completely. "You insolent little cripple. You think your tragic circumstances give you license to—" He caught himself before finishing the sentence, realizing he'd revealed too much of his true nature. But the damage was done. Emma had seen the man behind the robes, the petty tyrant, who viewed her father's memory and her own dignity as threats to his authority. "I think we're finished here, Judge Morrison," Emma said quietly, "unless you have something official to discuss regarding my husband's case." Morrison returned to his chair, struggling to reassemble his judicial composure. "Just remember what we've discussed today, Mrs. Dalton. Some stones are better left unturned." As Emma left the courthouse, she realized that Morrison's threats had accomplished the opposite of their intended effect. Instead of intimidating her into silence, they'd confirmed that she was on the right track. Whatever secret Mrs. Patterson was keeping about the night of the raid, it was important enough that Morrison was willing to abandon all pretense of civility to protect it. That evening, Emma sat by Mrs. Patterson's bedside as her friend and surrogate. Mother fought against the illness that was slowly claiming her life. The older woman's breathing was labored, but her eyes were clear and determined. "Emma, dear, there's something I need to tell you before it's too late. Something about the night. Your father died that I should have spoken up about years ago." Emma took Mrs. Patterson's frail hand in both of hers. "I'm listening." "I saw Judge Morrison that night, dear. I saw him talking to the men who led the raid on the town. They met behind the church about an hour before the attack began, and Morrison was giving them something, money, papers. I couldn't tell from where I was hiding, but I saw him shake hands with their leader like they were concluding business." The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow, even though part of her had been expecting something like this. Morrison hadn't just failed to prevent the raid that killed her father and destroyed her life. He'd been complicit in it. "Why didn't you tell anyone at the time?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid, dear. Morrison controlled everything. The law, the businesses, the people who could have protected me. I was just an old woman with no proof except my word against his. Who would have believed me?" Emma understood the older woman's fear, but she also understood that circumstances had changed. Morrison's threats that afternoon had revealed his desperation, his fear that the truth might finally come to light. "Mrs. Patterson, would you be willing to tell this story to others, people who might be able to help?" The older woman squeezed Emma's hand with surprising strength. "For you and your father's memory, dear, I'd face the devil himself." The blood-stained letter lay spread across Emma's kitchen table like a piece of damning evidence in a prosecutor's case. Mrs. Patterson had kept it hidden for 3 years, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. Now, as Emma read it by lamplight, the full scope of Judge Morrison's corruption became terrifyingly clear. The letter was addressed to Morrison in a rough, barely literate hand, but its meaning was unmistakable. It detailed payment for services rendered and mentioned dealing with the sheriff problem in terms that left no doubt about the writer's intentions. Most damning of all, it was dated 2 days before the raid that had killed her father and left her paralyzed. Emma's hands trembled as she absorbed the implications. Her father hadn't died in a random attack by desperate outlaws. He'd been murdered on Morrison's orders because his investigation into the judge's corruption had gotten too close to the truth. Mrs. Patterson sat propped up in bed, her breathing labored, but her eyes sharp with the clarity that sometimes comes to the dying. "I should have given you this years ago, dear. I was just so frightened of what Morrison might do if he found out I had it." "How did you get this letter?" Emma asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "I was cleaning Morrison's chambers the day it arrived. He left it on his desk while he went to speak with someone in the hallway. I don't know what made me take it. Intuition, perhaps, or just the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. When your father was killed 2 days later, I knew I'd been right to be suspicious." Emma read the letter again, noting details that painted an even darker picture of the conspiracy that had destroyed her life. The payment mentioned was substantial, enough to hire a dozen men for what the letter euphemistically called frontier justice. The writer promised that the matter would be handled permanently, and that there would be no survivors to cause future problems. Emma, Mrs. Patterson continued weakly, "There's more. I saw Morrison talking to the raiders behind the church, but I also saw something else. Your father wasn't supposed to be in town that night." Emma looked up from the letter, confusion mixing with growing horror. "What do you mean?" He'd received a message earlier that day, supposedly from a rancher up near Silver Creek reporting rustlers. It was meant to get him out of town, away from his office and the evidence he'd been gathering. But your father was suspicious. He'd been expecting something like this. Instead of riding out alone, he doubled back and hid near the jail to see what would happen. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. Morrison had arranged for her father to be lured away from town, planning to have his office ransacked and his evidence destroyed while he was gone. But Thomas Thornton had been too experienced a lawman to fall for such an obvious trap. So when the raiders came and found father waiting for them instead of an empty jail, they had to kill him. He'd seen too much, knew too much about Morrison's corruption. And when you tried to help your father during the fight, I became collateral. Damage. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. Morrison didn't order me shot, but he didn't care if I was hurt in the process of eliminating father. The revelation was shattering in its completeness. Not only had Morrison orchestrated her father's murder, but her own paralysis was a direct result of his corruption and greed. 3 years of pain, isolation, and struggle, all because one man had been willing to commit murder to protect his illegal activities. Mrs. Patterson reached out with a shaking hand to touch Emma's arm. "I'm so sorry, dear. I should have spoken up sooner. Maybe if the truth had come out immediately, you did what you thought was best to protect yourself. I understand that." Emma's voice was steady, but inside she felt like she was falling through space. "Mrs. Patterson, do you know what my father had discovered about Morrison? What corruption he was investigating?" The older woman nodded weakly. "Land deals, mostly. Morrison was using his position to acquire property illegally, then selling it to railroad companies and mining interests at enormous profits. Your father had documented dozens of cases where Morrison had declared abandoned land forfeit and then purchased it himself through intermediaries." Emma thought about the families she'd known who had lost their homes and businesses over the years, always through legal technicalities that Morrison had been happy to explain were beyond his control. Now she understood that those losses had been deliberate, part of a systematic plan to consolidate wealth and power. "There's something else," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "The night your father died, he wasn't just carrying evidence to his office. He was planning to take everything he'd gathered to the territorial marshal in Denver. Morrison found out about the planned trip and had to act immediately. The scope of Morrison's desperation became clear. He hadn't just been protecting his local corruption. He'd been preventing federal authorities from uncovering a conspiracy that reached into multiple territories and involved substantial sums of money. Emma carefully folded the letter and tucked it into her dress. For the first time since her marriage to Rafe, she felt like she held genuine power. Not the power of moral authority or righteous anger, but the concrete power of evidence that could destroy Morrison's carefully constructed empire. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you something difficult. Would you be willing to swear to all of this before witnesses? Would you be willing to testify about what you saw and what you know?" The old woman's face was pale, but her eyes burned with determination. "For your father's memory and for justice, yes, though I fear Morrison will try to stop us before we can make this public. Then we'll have to be very careful about how we proceed." Emma's mind was already working through the logistics of exposing Morrison while protecting herself and Mrs. Patterson from retaliation. "We'll need allies, people Morrison can't intimidate or corrupt. Dr. Hayes has always been honest. And there are others, people who've suffered under Morrison's rule, but were too afraid to speak up alone." Emma nodded, feeling a plan beginning to form. But first, she needed to tell Rafe what they'd discovered. The revelation that Morrison had orchestrated the raid would devastate him. Rafe had unknowingly been part of the conspiracy that had destroyed her life, even if he'd played no direct role in her father's death. As she prepared to leave for the jail, Emma caught sight of herself in the small mirror by the door. The woman looking back at her was different from the broken victim who had accepted Rafe's proposal 6 months ago. This woman had purpose, determination, and most importantly, the truth. The ride to the jail seemed longer than usual, weighted with the knowledge she carried. Emma rehearsed different ways to break the news to Rafe, trying to find words that would convey the horror of Morrison's betrayal without completely destroying her husband's fragile hope for redemption. Rafe took one look at her face when she arrived and immediately grew serious. "Emma, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have." Emma positioned her wheelchair close to his cell, noting that Sheriff Davies was occupied with paperwork at the far end of the building. "Rafe, I need to tell you something about the raid that killed my father. Something that's going to be difficult to hear." She told him everything. Mrs. Patterson's eyewitness account, the blood-stained letter, the systematic corruption that had motivated Morrison to order her father's murder. With each revelation, she watched Rafe's expression grow darker, saw the guilt and horror building in his eyes. "Jesus, Emma," he whispered when she finished. "I was part of it. Maybe not directly, but the gang I ran with, some of those men might have been involved in the raid. Morrison could have used my reputation, my connections to the outlaw community, to arrange the whole thing. You didn't know, Rafe. You couldn't have known what Morrison was planning, but I was part of the world that made it possible. My choices, my actions, they created the environment Morrison could exploit." Rafe's voice was thick with self-recrimination. "Emma, how can you even look at me, knowing that I might have helped the man who destroyed your life?" Emma reached through the bars to take his hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Because you're not responsible for Morrison's choices, only your own. And your choices since we've been married have shown me who you really are. I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not, but you have it anyway." Emma's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "The question now is what we're going to do with this information. Morrison knows I'm getting close to the truth. He threatened me yesterday, made it clear that he's willing to hurt both of us to protect his secrets." Rafe straightened, his guilt transforming into determination. "Then we expose him. We take this evidence to someone who can act on it, someone beyond Morrison's reach." The territorial marshal in Denver, that's where Father was planning to take his evidence before Morrison had him killed. "Can you get there safely? Morrison will be watching for any sign that you're trying to leave town." Emma smiled grimly. "Judge Morrison has made one crucial mistake, Rafe. He still thinks of me as helpless, as someone to be pitied rather than feared. He won't expect me to fight back effectively." As Emma prepared to leave that evening, she realized that everything had changed. What had begun as a marriage of desperation had become something deeper, a partnership forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. Morrison's revelation had given them not just evidence of his crimes, but a shared mission that transcended their individual circumstances. The blood-stained letter tucked safely in her dress seemed to pulse with possibility. For 3 years, Morrison had controlled the narrative of her father's death and her own tragedy. Now, finally, she had the power to tell the truth. The wooden evidence box that had belonged to Sheriff Thomas Thornton sat open on Emma's kitchen table, its contents spread like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together after 3 years of fragmented truth. Hidden beneath her father's old desk since the night of the raid, the box contained the complete documentation of Morrison's corruption, land deeds, forged documents, witness statements, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic theft and murder. Mrs. Patterson's condition had deteriorated rapidly since revealing Morrison's secret, as if the burden of carrying the truth for so long had been the only thing keeping her alive. Now, Propped up in Emma's spare bedroom, where she could receive constant care, the elderly woman drifted in and out of consciousness, but her moments of clarity burned with fierce determination to see justice done. "The Marshal," Mrs. Patterson whispered during one of her lucid periods. "Your father trusted Marshal Richardson in Denver, said he was one of the few honest lawmen left in the territory." Emma nodded, making careful notes in her father's old journal. "I'll send word to him, but we need to be careful about how we communicate. Morrison has eyes everywhere in this town." Dr. Hayes had become an unexpected ally, his medical oath compelling him to support their cause once he learned the truth about the raid. His evening visits to check on Mrs. Patterson provided perfect cover for clandestine meetings, and his respected position in the community gave their efforts legitimacy. "Emma," Dr. Hayes said quietly as he finished examining Mrs. Patterson, "I've been thinking about the other families Morrison has hurt over the years. The Hendersons lost their ranch to a foreclosure that seemed questionable at the time. The Murphy family's store was seized for back taxes that they insisted they'd already paid. If we're going to expose Morrison, we should gather all the victims together." The idea of building a coalition had merit, but Emma recognized the dangers involved. The more people who know what we're planning, the greater the risk that word will get back to Morrison before we're ready. Perhaps. But there's also strength in numbers. Morrison's power comes from keeping his victims isolated, making each family think they're alone in their suffering. Emma looked down at the evidence spread across her table. Years of her father's methodical investigation, documented proof of crimes that reached far beyond simple corruption into systematic oppression of an entire community. The scope of Morrison's influence was staggering, but it also revealed potential weaknesses in his seemingly impenetrable position. Rafe had become her closest advisor, despite the physical barriers between them. Their daily conversations had evolved into strategic planning sessions, his experience with the criminal underworld providing insights into Morrison's likely responses to different approaches. "Morrison will try to discredit you first," Rafe had warned during their meeting the previous day. "He'll paint you as a bitter cripple seeking revenge, someone whose judgment has been clouded by personal tragedy. You need to be prepared for character assassination before he resorts to more direct methods." Emma had considered this possibility, recognizing that her physical limitations and emotional investment in the case could be used against her. But she also understood that Morrison's dismissive attitude toward her capabilities might work to her advantage. The plan they'd developed was necessarily complex, requiring careful timing and coordination among people who had never worked together before. Emma would travel to Denver to meet with Marshal Richardson, carrying copies of all the evidence while leaving the originals safely hidden. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes would quietly gather statements from Morrison's other victims, building a comprehensive case that would be difficult to dismiss or suppress. Mrs. Patterson's role was perhaps the most crucial and dangerous. As the only direct witness to Morrison's meeting with the raiders, her testimony would be essential for proving murder rather than simple corruption. But her failing health made it uncertain whether she would survive long enough to testify in court. "I need to tell you something, Emma," Mrs. Patterson said during one of her increasingly rare moments of clarity. "There's another witness to what Morrison did, someone who saw him with the raiders that night." Emma leaned closer, hardly daring to hope. "Who?" "Young Tommy Brennan was sneaking out to meet Sally Henderson behind the church that night. He saw the whole meeting, heard Morrison giving orders to the men who killed your father. But he was only 14 at the time, and he was terrified that he'd get in trouble for being out after curfew." Emma's heart raced with the possibility of corroborating testimony. Tommy Brennan was now 17 and working as an apprentice to the town's blacksmith, old enough to testify credibly and young enough to be relatively safe from Morrison's direct retaliation. "Do you think he'd be willing to come forward?" "If someone explained what was at stake, yes. Tommy's always felt guilty about not speaking up sooner. He's been carrying the secret almost as long as I have." The addition of a second witness transformed their case from promising to potentially overwhelming. Morrison might be able to discredit one elderly woman, but two independent witnesses to the same conspiracy would be much harder to dismiss. Emma spent the following days carefully approaching the people who had been hurt by Morrison's corruption, finding them more willing to talk than she'd expected. Years of accumulated grievances had created a reservoir of resentment that needed only proper channeling to become a powerful force for change. The Henderson family had lost their ranch through foreclosure proceedings that violated their rights. As homesteaders, the Murphy store had been seized based on tax assessments that had been deliberately miscalculated. The widow Carson had been forced to sell her late husband's mining claim for a fraction of its value after Morrison ruled that her marriage certificate was invalid due to a clerical error. Each story followed the same pattern: legal technicalities used to justify theft, official procedures manipulated to benefit Morrison and his associates, victims left with no recourse because Morrison controlled the only court in the territory. "We always knew something wasn't right," Mrs. Henderson confided during a secret meeting in Emma's parlor. "But what could we do? Morrison was the law in this town. Fighting him meant losing everything we had left." Emma understood their fear, but she also recognized that Morrison's greatest strength, his absolute control over local institutions, was also his weakness. His corruption was so systematic and obvious that exposing it would be like pulling a single thread that unraveled an entire tapestry of crime. The most dangerous part of their plan involved getting the evidence to Denver without alerting Morrison to their intentions. Emma's regular visits to the jail provided perfect cover for passing information to Rafe, who used his network of former associates to identify safe routes and trustworthy contacts along the way. "There's a freight wagon that runs supplies to the territorial prison twice a month," Rafe had explained during one of their planning sessions. "The driver, Jonas Miller, owes me a favor from the old days. He'd get you to Denver safely and wouldn't ask questions about why you need to travel quietly." Emma had initially resisted the idea of involving anyone connected to Rafe's criminal past, but she'd come to understand that desperate times required unconventional allies. Jonas Miller might be a man of questionable legality, but his loyalty to Rafe was absolute, and his knowledge of backroads and safe houses could prove invaluable. The timing of their operation was critical. Morrison had been applying increasing pressure, making it clear through various intermediaries that Emma's continued investigation would have consequences. Sheriff Davies had started finding excuses to limit her visiting hours with Rafe, and several townspeople had mentioned being questioned about their interactions with her. "He's getting desperate," Dr. Hayes observed during one of their clandestine meetings. "Desperate men make mistakes, but they also become more dangerous. We need to move soon before he decides to take more direct action." Emma had already noticed increased surveillance of her daily activities. Men she didn't recognize lingered near her house at odd hours, and her mail seemed to arrive later than usual, as if it were being intercepted and read before delivery. Morrison was tightening his grip, preparing for whatever action he deemed necessary to protect his secrets. The final piece of their preparation involved creating multiple copies of all evidence and distributing them to different hiding places around town. If Morrison discovered their plan and moved against them before they could reach Denver, the truth would survive, even if they didn't. "I've hidden copies with 3 different families," Dr. Hayes reported. "People Morrison can't touch directly because they're too well connected or too visible in the community. Even if he moves against us, the evidence will surface eventually." Emma felt the weight of responsibility settling over her like a heavy cloak. So many people were depending on her success, trusting her to carry their hopes for justice to someone who could actually deliver it. The scared, broken woman who had accepted Rafe's marriage proposal 6 months ago seemed like a different person entirely. Mrs. Patterson's final lucid conversation came on a cold evening when the winter wind rattled The windows of Emma's small house. The elderly woman had rallied enough strength for one last crucial revelation. Emma leaned close, recognizing that this might be Mrs. Patterson's last opportunity to share whatever secret she'd been keeping. After Morrison met with the raiders, after they shook hands and the men dispersed, I saw Morrison do something strange. He went to the cemetery and spent several minutes at your mother's grave, talking to himself like he was having a conversation with her. The image was disturbing in its implications. Emma's mother had died of fever when Emma was 12, years before Morrison's corruption had reached its current levels. What connection could there have been between Morrison and her mother's memory? What was he saying? I couldn't hear the words from where I was hidden, but his posture was that of a man asking for forgiveness, or maybe trying to justify something terrible he was about to do. When he finished, he placed something on the gravestone, a flower, I think, or maybe a letter. Emma felt ice form in her stomach as the implications sank in. Morrison's corruption hadn't been merely professional, there had been a personal element. Something connected to her family that went beyond her father's investigation. Mrs. Patterson, did Morrison know my mother well before she died? The older woman's eyes flickered with something that might have been understanding or fear. Your mother was a beautiful woman, Emma, and she was unhappy in her marriage for reasons she never spoke about publicly. But there were rumors, whispers about her receiving visits when your father was away on circuit, flowers delivered with no name attached. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow. Morrison hadn't just murdered her father to protect his corruption. He'd eliminated a romantic rival, a man who had possessed something Morrison wanted but could never have. He was in love with my mother, Emma whispered. Obsessed might be a better word. After she died, he became increasingly erratic, using his position to accumulate power and wealth, as if those things could fill the emptiness she'd left behind. Your father's investigation threatened to expose not just his crimes, but his deepest shame, that he'd built his entire corrupt empire as some twisted monument to a woman who had never returned his affections. The psychological dimension of Morrison's motivation added a new layer of danger to their situation. They weren't just dealing with a corrupt official protecting his illegal activities. They were facing a man whose crimes were rooted in obsession and unrequited love, emotions that made him far less predictable and potentially more violent. Emma spent that night sitting by Mrs. Patterson's bedside, watching her friend slip away while contemplating the full scope of what they were up against. Morrison's corruption was systematic and extensive, but it was his personal obsession that made him truly dangerous. As dawn broke over Perdition Ridge, Emma made her final preparations for the journey to Denver. The evidence was carefully packed in a specially designed compartment hidden in her wheelchair, while copies were distributed among their allies in town. Tommy Brennan had agreed to meet with Marshal Richardson if Emma successfully made contact, and Dr. Hayes had prepared detailed statements from Morrison's other victims. The plan was as ready as they could make it, but Emma understood that once she left Perdition Ridge, there would be no turning back. Morrison would certainly realize what she was attempting, and his response would likely be swift and merciless. Rafe's final words to her carried the weight of everything they'd shared and everything they still hoped to achieve together. Emma, whatever happens, I want you to know that these 6 months with you have been the best of my life. You've shown me that redemption is possible, that people can change and grow beyond their worst mistakes. If Morrison tries to stop you, if things go wrong, they won't go wrong, Emma interrupted firmly. We have the truth on our side, and truth has a way of surviving even when the people carrying it don't. As Jonas Miller's freight wagon rolled out of Perdition Ridge in the pre-dawn darkness, Emma looked back at the town that had been her prison and her salvation. Behind her lay everything she'd ever known. The grave of her parents, the house where she'd learned to live with her limitations, the jail where she'd discovered love in the most unlikely circumstances. Ahead lay Denver and Marshal Richardson. The territorial capital where federal law still meant something, where Judge Morrison's corruption couldn't reach. Emma carried with her not just evidence of crimes, but the hopes of an entire community for justice long delayed. The torch of truth was finally lit, and Emma Dalton was carrying it toward the light. The torch burned bright in Emma's hand as she positioned her wheelchair at the center of Perdition Ridge's town square, its flame casting dancing shadows across the faces of neighbors who had gathered in response to word that spread like wildfire through the community. The symbolic torch, hastily constructed from a wooden handle and oil-soaked rags, represented more than defiance. It was the light of truth, finally breaking through years of enforced darkness. 3 days had passed since Emma's return from Denver, and the town buzzed with whispered speculation about her meeting with federal authorities. Judge Morrison had grown increasingly desperate during her absence, sending his remaining allies to intimidate potential witnesses and frantically attempting to destroy evidence of his corruption. But it was too late. The truth had been set in motion, and no amount of intimidation could stop what was coming. Emma had chosen the town square for this confrontation deliberately, the same place where Morrison had forced his cruel marriage. Boggin 6 months ago. Now the tables were turned, and it was Morrison who faced an impossible choice between surrender and destruction. Dr. Hayes stood nearby, his medical bag at his side, but his real purpose far different from treating patients. In his possession were sworn statements from dozens of Morrison's victims, each document representing years of suffering finally given voice. Tommy Brennan waited at the edge of the crowd, his young face pale but determined as he prepared to speak the truth he'd carried in silence for 3 years. Judge Morrison emerged from the courthouse in his black robes, but his usual theatrical confidence had been replaced by something approaching desperation. His face was haggard, his eyes darting nervously across the assembled townspeople as if searching for escape routes or hidden threats. "What is the meaning of this gathering?" Morrison called out, his voice still carrying the authority of his office, but lacking its former conviction. "I have important judicial business to attend to, and I will not tolerate disruption of official proceedings." Emma raised the torch higher, its flame bright against the afternoon sky. "Citizens of Perdition Ridge, I stand before you today with evidence of crimes that have plagued our community for years. Crimes committed by the man who was supposed to protect us, who instead used his position to rob us, intimidate us, and murder anyone who threatened to expose his corruption." A murmur ran through the crowd, part excitement, part fear at hearing such direct accusations made publicly. Emma could see the mix of emotions on familiar faces, hope warring with skepticism, anger battling against years of learned helplessness. Morrison stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "This is preposterous. The ravings of a bitter woman seeking revenge for personal tragedies that had nothing to do with me. I will not stand here and listen to such slanderous accusations from a crippled—" "Choose your words carefully, Judge Morrison," Emma interrupted, her voice carrying across the square with surprising strength. "These good people have gathered to hear the truth. And the truth is that you ordered my father's murder 3 years ago to protect your illegal activities." The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps of shock mixed with angry shouts as people began to understand the full scope of what Emma was alleging. Morrison's face went pale, then flushed red as he struggled to maintain his composure. "You have no proof of such wild accusations," Morrison snarled. "The word of a disabled woman against a duly appointed judge of this territory, the word of multiple witnesses," Emma replied firmly. "Mrs. Patterson saw you meeting with the raiders behind the church the night my father died. She watched you shake hands with the men who murdered Sheriff Thomas Thornton, saw you hand them payment for their bloody work." Dr. Hayes stepped forward from the crowd, raising a leather satchel filled with documents. "And I have statements from every family in this town who has been robbed by Morrison's corruption. The Henderson Ranch, stolen through fraudulent foreclosure. The Murphy store, seized based on fabricated tax liens. The Carson mining claim, taken through deliberately invalid paperwork. Emma watched Morrison's face as the accusations mounted, saw the calculation behind his eyes as he weighed his dwindling options. The judge's carefully constructed facade of legitimate authority was cracking, revealing the desperate criminal beneath. "Show me these supposed documents," Morrison demanded, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Bring forward these alleged witnesses if they exist." Tommy Brennan stepped out from the crowd, his young face flushed with nervous determination. At 17, he was no longer the frightened 14-year-old boy who had hidden his terrible secret. But Emma could see the courage it took for him to face the man whose power had silenced him for so long. "I was there that night, Judge Morrison," Tommy called out, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "I saw you talking to those men behind the church. I heard you tell them that Sheriff Thornton had to be eliminated permanently, that there could be no witnesses left to testify about what they might have seen." The testimony of a second witness sent visible shock through Morrison's remaining supporters. Emma could see the shift in the crowd's mood as people realized that the accusations weren't the product of one woman's bitter imagination, but the testimony of multiple witnesses to the same conspiracy. Morrison's judicial composure was cracking visibly now, his authority evaporating as more townspeople began to voice their own grievances and suspicions that had been suppressed for years. The fear that had kept the community silent was being replaced by righteous anger, as they finally understood how completely they had been betrayed. "These are the fantasies of children and madmen," Morrison protested, but his voice lacked its former conviction. "I have served this community faithfully for over a decade, bringing law and order to a lawless frontier town." Emma smiled grimly and reached into her dress, pulling out the federal warrants she had carried back from Denver. The official documents seemed to glow in the torchlight as she held them up for all to see. "United States Marshal Richardson has issued warrants for your arrest on charges of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption of public office," Emma announced, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent square. "Federal agents are currently gathering evidence from your office and residence, and witnesses are prepared to testify before a federal judge in Denver." The effect of the federal warrants was immediate and decisive. Morrison's remaining support among the townspeople evaporated like morning mist as people realized that higher authorities were finally taking action against the corruption that had plagued their community for years. But Emma could see in Morrison's eyes that he wasn't finished. Desperation made men dangerous, and she recognized the look of someone preparing for one final, desperate gambit to salvage what remained of his crumbling empire. The scales of justice seemed to tip in that moment as Judge Morrison's facade finally crumbled completely, revealing the desperate criminal who had hidden behind judicial robes for so many years. His own gavel, the symbol of authority he had, corrupted for personal gain, lay forgotten in the dust at Emma's feet, having fallen from his trembling hands as the weight of his exposure settled over him. Morrison's eyes darted frantically across the crowd of townspeople who had once cowered before his authority, searching for allies who no longer existed, escape routes that federal agents had already blocked. Emma could see the exact moment when he realized that his carefully constructed empire was beyond salvaging, when desperation replaced calculation in his fevered mind. "You think you've won," Morrison snarled, his hand moving toward the concealed weapon Emma had expected him to carry. "You think your federal friends can protect you from justice, but accidents happen in frontier towns, especially to meddling cripples who don't know their place." The crowd began to scatter in panic as Morrison drew his pistol, but Emma held her ground, the torch burning steadily in her raised hand. She had prepared for this moment, had known that a man like Morrison would choose violence over accountability when all other options were exhausted. "Threatening me in front of witnesses won't change anything, Judge Morrison," Emma said calmly, her voice carrying across the square despite the chaos around her. "The evidence is already in federal hands. My death would only add another murder. A charge to your inevitable conviction." "Maybe," Morrison replied, his voice thick with rage and desperation. "But it would give me the satisfaction of silencing Thomas Thornton's interfering daughter once and for all. Your father should have minded his own business, just like you should have stayed in your place." Emma could see Rafe struggling against his guards at the edge of the square, desperate to reach her, but restrained by the shackles that still bound him despite his cooperation with the investigation. The sight of her husband's anguish gave her strength, reminding her of everything they had built together and everything they still hoped to achieve. "My father was 10 times the man you'll ever be," Emma replied firmly. "He served this community with honor while you robbed it blind. His legacy will outlive your corruption by generations." Morrison's hand shook as conflicting emotions warred. Across his haggard face, rage, fear, and the dawning recognition of his own inevitable defeat. The torch in Emma's hand continued to burn brightly, its flame unwavering despite the weapon pointed at her heart. Dr. Hayes stepped forward from his position in the crowd, moving slowly but deliberately to place himself between Morrison and Emma. "It's over, Harrison. Federal agents are already in town. Your crimes are documented beyond denial, and your victims are finally finding their voices. Surrender now, and you might avoid the hangman's noose." "Stand aside, Hayes," Morrison warned, swinging his pistol toward the doctor. "This doesn't concern you." "Everything that happens in this town concerns me," Dr. Hayes replied steadily. "I've watched you destroy good people for years, watched families torn apart by your greed." "No more." Other townspeople began stepping forward, men and women who had suffered under Morrison's rule but had never found the courage to resist until now. Mrs. Henderson, whose family had lost their ranch to fraudulent foreclosure. Murphy, whose store had been seized on fabricated charges. The widow Carson, forced to sell her mining claim for pennies on the dollar. "You stole our ranch," Mrs. Henderson accused, her voice shaking with suppressed fury. 20 years of work, gone because of your lies and corruption. "My store supported 3 families," Murphy added. "You destroyed our livelihoods for your own profit." Morrison swung his weapon back and forth, overwhelmed by the chorus of accusation from people he had considered safely intimidated. "All of you stay back. I am still the law in this town." "No," Emma said quietly, reaching down to pick up Morrison's fallen gavel. "You were never the law. You were just a criminal with a badge, and your authority died the moment federal agents arrived, with warrants for your arrest." She held the gavel alongside her torch, twin symbols of justice and truth finally working together, as they should have all along. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Morrison's own symbol of authority being used to pronounce his downfall. "Judge Morrison," Emma continued formally, "by the authority of the United States Marshal's Office and the Territory of Colorado, I charge you with the murder of Sheriff Thomas Thornton, conspiracy to commit fraud, corruption of public office, and theft of public lands. You will be taken to Denver to face trial before an honest court." Morrison's weapon wavered as the weight of his defeat finally settled over him completely. Emma could see the moment when his desperate bravado cracked, when the magnitude of his situation penetrated the fog of rage and fear that had driven him to this final confrontation. Federal agents emerged from concealment positions around the square. They had been present all along, Emma realized, ensuring her safety while allowing the dramatic exposure of Morrison's crimes to unfold in the most public way possible. The careful coordination spoke to Marshal Richardson's understanding that justice needed to be seen as well as served. "Drop your weapon, Morrison," called Agent Patterson, his own pistol trained on the corrupt judge. "You're surrounded and outgunned. Surrender peacefully, and you'll live to stand trial." Morrison's pistol finally dropped from his nerveless fingers as the reality of his situation overwhelmed him. The man who had ruled Perdition Ridge through fear and intimidation was reduced to a broken figure in dusty robes. his empire of corruption crumbling around him like a house built on sand. As federal agents moved to secure Morrison, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the courthouse. Emma felt tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of relief and vindication that had been 3 years in the coming. The torch in her hand continued to burn brightly, its flame now carried by an entire community, ready to build something better on the ashes of Morrison's corrupt regime. Justice had finally come to Perdition Ridge, and it had arrived in the form of a woman in a wheelchair who refused to accept that her limitations defined her possibilities. 6 months after Judge Morrison's arrest and subsequent conviction in Denver, Emma stood at her kitchen window, watching the bustling main street of Perdition Ridge, with a sense of wonder at how much could change when corruption was finally rooted out and replaced with honest governance. The wooden crutches leaning against the wall beside her represented more than just physical progress. They were symbols of hope, determination, and the power of refusing to accept limitations others tried to impose. The transformation of the town had been remarkable. With Morrison's stranglehold on local government broken, federal authorities had appointed an interim administration that immediately began the process of returning stolen property to its rightful owners. The Henderson family had reclaimed their ranch, the Murphys had reopened their store, and dozens of other families had seen justice restored to their lives. Emma's own life had been transformed in ways she could never have imagined during those dark months before her marriage to Rafe. Her work as an advocate for justice and outcasts had evolved into an official position with the new territorial government, providing legal assistance to families who had been victimized by corruption throughout the region. The physical therapy that Rafe had encouraged during their courtship had yielded results beyond anyone's expectations, while Emma would never regain full use of her legs. She had developed enough strength and balance to walk short distances with the help of her crutches. More importantly, she had reclaimed her sense of agency and purpose. Dr. Hayes knocked softly on her door, arriving for his regular visit with news that had become routine, but never lost its ability to bring joy. "Good morning, Emma. How are you? Feeling today?" Emma turned from the window with a radiant smile, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her growing belly. "Wonderful, Dr. Hayes. The baby was quite active last night. I think he or she is going to be as stubborn and determined as their parents." The pregnancy had been unexpected, but deeply welcome, a symbol of new life emerging from circumstances that had once seemed hopeless. Rafe's official pardon from the territorial governor had cleared the way for him to serve as deputy sheriff under the new administration, putting his knowledge of criminal behavior to work in protecting the community he'd once threatened. And Rafe, how is he adjusting to civilian law enforcement? Emma laughed, a sound filled with genuine happiness that would have seemed impossible during her darkest days. "He's thriving. Yesterday, he helped resolve a property dispute that could have turned violent, and the week before he tracked down stolen cattle for the Brennan family. He says it feels good to use his skills to help people instead of hurting them." The transformation in Rafe had been as dramatic as Emma's own journey. The desperate, resigned man who had pointed to her in the town square had become a respected member of the community, someone children looked up to and adults trusted with their safety. His marriage to Emma had provided the anchor he'd needed to leave his outlaw past behind completely. Mrs. Patterson's funeral 3 months earlier had been a celebration of a life well lived and a final act of courage that had helped restore justice to an entire community. In her final days, she had provided detailed testimony to federal investigators that helped convict not just Morrison, but several of his associates in neighboring towns. Emma walked slowly to her desk, where she kept the letter that had arrived from Denver the previous week. Marshal Richardson's official commendation recognized her role in exposing one of the most extensive corruption cases in territorial history. But more importantly, it validated her father's memory and the integrity that had cost him his life. The new sheriff, an honest man named William Carter, who had been recommended by Marshal Richardson himself, had asked Emma to establish a victim assistance program that would help other communities identify and combat corruption. The work gave her a sense of purpose that transcended her personal circumstances, allowing her to turn her own suffering into a force for positive change. As she prepared for her daily visit to town, no longer to a jail, but to the sheriff's office where Rafe worked, Emma caught sight of herself in the mirror by the door. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the broken victim who had accepted a desperate marriage proposal less than a year ago. This woman stood tall despite her physical limitations, carried herself with dignity and purpose, and radiated the quiet confidence that comes from surviving the worst and choosing to build something better from the wreckage. The wedding ring on her finger, once a symbol of desperate expedience, now represented a love that had grown from mutual respect into something deep and abiding. The walk to the sheriff's office showcased the renewed vitality of Perdition Ridge. New businesses were opening, families were moving back to town, and the atmosphere of fear and resignation that had characterized Morrison's rule had been replaced by optimism and community spirit. Rafe looked up from his paperwork as Emma entered the office, his face lighting up with the same expression of wonder and gratitude that had become familiar over the months of their deepening relationship. "Mrs. Dalton," he said formally, rising to help her to a chair, "to what do I have the honor of this visit?" Emma settled into the comfortable chair he'd procured, specially for her visits, noting how naturally he moved between his official duties and his personal attentiveness to her needs. "Deputy Dalton," she replied with mock seriousness, "I have a report to file about suspicious activity in our neighborhood. It seems someone has been leaving flowers on my windowsill every morning, along with small carved animals that bear a striking resemblance to the work of a certain reformed outlaw of my acquaintance." Rafe's grin was answer enough, but he played along with their familiar game. "That does sound suspicious, ma'am. I'll have to investigate this matter personally, perhaps over dinner this evening." "I think that would be appropriate, Deputy. In the interest of thorough law enforcement, of course." Their easy banter reflected the comfort they'd found in each other's company, the way their relationship had evolved from desperate expedience to genuine partnership, to deep, abiding love. They had become true partners in every sense, personally, professionally, and in their shared commitment to justice and community service. As the afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a forgotten woman living on the margins of a corrupt community, her life seemingly over at 26. Now she was a wife, soon to be a mother, a respected advocate for justice, and a living example that redemption and transformation were possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. The wooden bird that Rafe had carved during their courtship still sat on her kitchen windowsill, but it was no longer alone. A growing collection of small, carved animals reflected the deepening of their relationship and the family they were building together. Each piece was a reminder that beautiful things could emerge from patient, careful work, just as their marriage had grown from the most unpromising beginnings into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Emma took Rafe's hand as they prepared to leave the office together, feeling the familiar strength and gentleness in his touch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to serve their community, but tonight they would sit by their own fire, planning for their child's future and marveling at the unexpected paths that had led them to happiness. The sun set over Perdition Ridge, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and Emma Thornton Dalton walked home beside her husband, her crutches keeping steady time with his measured steps, both of them moving forward together into a future bright with possibility.